Okay, so we're looking now at the beginning of chapter 9. And the question that we're looking at is actually 7. It's numbered 8, but it should be 7. How does Palahniuk underline the connection between the death rebirth motif and the soap symbol? And it says, bear in mind, lie is the aggressive chemical component of soap, while the other part is fat. This takes some close reading, this passage. It's quite complex in terms of how the symbol functions in the text itself. So, Tyler's saliva did 2 jobs. The wet kiss on the back of my hand held the flakes of lye while they burned. That was the first job. The second was lye only burns when you combine it with water or saliva. This is a chemical burn, Tyler said, and it will hurt more than you've ever burned. You can use lye to open clogged drains. Close your eyes. A paste of lime water can burn through an aluminium pan. A solution of lime water will dissolve a wooden spoon. Again, it's not a coincidence that these are all kind of consumer goods. And actually, clogged drains are the kind of runoff of consumer society. And so lye then obviously looks like this kind of aggressive chemical that burns through the inauthenticity and the kind of clag of consumer society. It is a sort of a symbolic embodiment of that aggressive, virile id component that Tyler Durden represents in the narrator's psyche. So combined with water, lye heats to over 200 degrees, and as it heats, it burns into the back of my hand, and Tyler places his fingers of one hand over my fingers. Our hands spread on the lap of my bloodstained pants, and Tyler says to pay attention, because this is the greatest moment of my life. So the question is obviously about the death rebirth motif and the soap symbol. We've got this component that is a feature of the soap symbol. And it's the component of that soap symbol that is destructive and violent and aggressive. So if you see the soap as maybe an analogy for the assimilation of the components of the psyche into a coherent whole that's cleansing the narrator himself, then the lie obviously is the self-destructive, aggressive component that must operate first, but then eventually be conjoined with something else in order to make it safe. Lye on its own is extremely dangerous, but lye mixed with fat, mixed with some kind of emollient like fat, turns it into soap, which is obviously useful and cleansing. And I think suggests the narrator's regeneration and cleansing, but also the integration of these different parts of the psyche that on their own are dangerous. Lye is a kind of symbol of what Tyler represents as something aggressive and dangerous and requiring assimilation into something else to make it coherent and whole. Obviously, this presents us the irony later on in the text where soap becomes a consumer product that the narrator sells. So there's this obvious irony here involved in this symbol that's right at the core of the meaning of the novel, is that once these components of the psyche have been re-assimilated into something coherent, that ends up being sold. And it sort of mirrors the book metaphorically, that you can mount this sort of aggressive critique of consumer capitalism and yet be assimilated into it and find yourself hypocritically taking part in the social and economic phenomena that the book criticizes. So the soap symbol is right at the heart of the significance of the story, and the lie component of this is very directly connected to the id component of the psyche and the aggressive power that it possesses in terms of reinvigorating the narrator through a more direct connection with reality. So if you see lie as the death component of the death rebirth motif, the violent component of the psyche, the id component of the psyche, the Tyler Durden part of the narrator's identity, that's where it features overall as one of the symbolic components of soap. Further on, at the bottom of 76, we move on to the next question. It says, how does this section develop the connection between the death rebirth motif and the soap symbol? So we have through this chapter the kind of explanation of how this works. And this passage here, I think, can be read metaphorically as a kind of an explanation of the way that death and rebirth function in this novel as a sort of a route to self-regeneration. Rain, Tyler says, fell on the burnt pyre year after year. And he's talking about a place in Ireland where people had been burnt at the stake, and then the consequences of that burning were to accidentally manufacture soap. Rain, Tyler says, fell on the burnt pyre year after year, people were burned, and the rain seeped through the wood and ashes to become a solution of lie. Now, you've got there the destructive component of the psyche, and also the connotation of self-sacrifice that is being evoked here through the actions that create the lie. So the self-sacrifice here is just like the narrator's self-destruction earlier on when he burns his hand with the lie. And the lie combined with the melted fat of the sacrifices, and a thick white discharge of soap crept out from the base of the altar. So you have here the fat of the sacrifices. Here, this is the component. This is a sort of ego component of the psyche, needing to incorporate something excessive. It connects to consumer society by virtue of its connotation of excess, but that excess needs to be brought together with the aggressive, violent component in order to make something soapy, something that's potentially reconstituted into a coherent whole that's useful and cleansing. And so that it has this kind of sense of rebirth, and that it's from these potentially either useless components of this kind of violent, aggressive chemical, and then fat. Out of that, these kind of useless individual components are sublimated into something useful and cleansing, which is, I think, the dynamic of the story, is that Tyler himself is kind of useless because it's overtly violent. It can only be useful if his id impulses are reintegrated into a coherent sense of self. So you have here the components of soap being connected to this sense of destruction and rebirth that the novel narrates. You must use the lie to destroy yourself, combine it with this flabby substance, the inauthentic self of the narrator in the opening, the IKEA furniture sort of fetishes and all these things, in order to make the soap the coherent self that in some way will be restorative or regenerative. Okay, let's move on to the next one, 10, which is the next chapter here. And this chapter is largely concerned much more straightforwardly with social conflict, I think, because it's the first instance where the narrator finds himself carrying out this kind of what becomes a sort of a light form of domestic terrorism that in the end evolves into Project Mayhem. So it says, how does Palahniuk develop the link between the narrator's internal conflict and the conflict with society at the top of page 80? So he's on his way to carry out a service job, waiting on tables at a wealthy person's kind of party or banquet. And this is the passage that we're focusing on here. With the elevator stopped between floors, my view is about a cockroach above the green linoleum, and from here at cockroach level, the green corridor stretches toward the vanishing point, past half-open doors, where titans and their gigantic wives drink barrels of champagne and bellow at each other wearing diamonds bigger than I feel. So if you think here about his position, the fact that he's kind of trapped in between floors, I think, gives us the sense of his kind of slightly liminal sense of self and his kind of transitional identity. There's a sort of physical equivalent here. But this repetition of cockroach in the passage obviously gives us this sense of him being in some way kind of emasculated and diminished and turned into something insignificant, and through his service role, he's carrying out a service to people who are overtly superior to him and feels kind of like vermin because of this. And then it stretches towards the vanishing point, past half-open doors where titans and their gigantic wives. He's obviously using this phrase very deliberately to give us a sense of them being godlike and old and grotesquely indulgent. They're drinking barrels of champagne, bellowing at each other, wearing diamonds bigger than I feel. So if we think of the lie as being this violent, aggressive, corrosive symbol in the previous chapter, well, here's the fat. Here's the fat of society, these giant fat people drinking barrels of champagne, bellowing at each other. And the action that he is about to carry out, disrupting this particular event, is a type of lie type action where he is corrosive and aggressive and enacts this internal conflict, but on a social level. So that component of his psyche, the lie component of his psyche, the Tyler Durden id component of his psyche, is being publicly enacted here through his attack on the influential and powerful individuals in society and the way that they're portrayed at this kind of banquet scene. The next question is the top to mid of 81, and it asks us, how does Palahniuk underline the link between the narrator's sense of social conflict and the nature of post-industrial capitalism? Consider the role of services as a replacement for primary industry. Now, this is the passage we want to concern ourselves mostly with. Tyler and me, we've turned into the guerrilla terrorists of the service industry. So we've got this kind of very deliberate, explicit naming of the target of his attack. Dinner party saboteurs. The hotel caters dinner parties, and when somebody wants the food, they get the food and the wine and the china and glassware and the waiters. They get the works all on one bill, and because they know they can't threaten you with a tip, to them you're just a cockroach, and there's the connotation of this at the end from the previous passage. Tyler, he did a dinner party one time, and this was when Tyler turned into a renegade waiter. The first dinner party, Tyler was serving the fish course in this white and glass cloud of a house that seemed to float over the city on steel legs attached to the hillside. So we have this combination here of all of these phrases like renegade waiter and the guerrilla terrorists of the service industry that seem to be contradictory. You know, you have this idea that in some way you're serving others, and yet you're renegade or a guerrilla. You're in aggressive conflict with them. And so we've got here this representation of this active battle with society because of its disempowerment of men through the provision of service jobs in the place of, in an industrial economy, industrial work. So here, there's something fundamentally emasculating about this type of work that perhaps working in a foundry or, using steel girders or building a boat or something along these lines would not be. And so this is the site of the social conflict that Tyler enacts. It's against this service role, this emasculating service role, and the people who have benefited from this social organization. The last question of chapter 10 is how the passage on the middle of 84 makes use of the death rebirth motif in order to underline social conflict. So we've got this final little passage after Tyler and the narrator have disrupted this party and kind of harassed and, I guess, terrorized is probably a little bit hyperbolic for what they've done at this point, but there is some kind of active campaign of violent resistance that they carry out here. The host pulls Madam to her feet again, Madam holding her hands up as if she were praying, but with her hands an inch apart and blood running down the palms, down the wrists, across a diamond bracelet, and to her elbows where it drips. And the host, he says, "It will be all right, Nina. My hands, Walter, it will be all right. Who would do this with me? Who could hate me this much? Would you call an ambulance?" That was Tyler's first mission as a service industry terrorist, guerrilla waiter, minimum wage despoiler. Tyler's been doing this for years, but he says everything is more fun as a shared activity. So we've got this kind of suggestion here of, I think, the stigmata and the sacrificial nature of Jesus' own sacrifice, that we've got these hands up as if she were praying, and then you've got the blood running down the palms across a diamond bracelet to her elbows where it drips. This is a very clear, I think, allusion to the stigmata, Jesus' kind of wounds from the crucifix. And we've got here then some sense of possible redemption through this violent attack on the powerful figures in society. We've got here an example of, I think, an allusive symbolic sense of the regenerative and restorative potential of these violent acts of kind of social disruption that Tyler and the narrator seem to enact, in the incipient, the beginning form of Project Mayhem.